Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. Today is the anniversary of the most dastardly terrorist attack carried out on Indian soil. An attack that claimed 164 lives, left over 300 injured and sent shockwaves around the world. Terrorism has reared its ugly head every now and then and has devastated the world like nothing else. It is an issue that has affected millions of people from Asia to the Americas, but till date there is no consensus on an international convention. Several efforts have been made to address the problem, but negotiations have been deadlocked even after 2 decades of deliberations. On the 10th anniversary of 26/11, we will try and understand why the world hasn't been able to come up with an international convention on terrorism. Joining me on The Big Picture today are Professor Swaran Singh, School of International Studies, JNU, Dilip Sinha, former ambassador, and Major General Ravi Arora, retired Chief Editor, Indian Military Review. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Let me begin the program with you, Professor. What is the status really as far as International Convention on Terrorism is concerned?
If you look at the current status, there is a sixth committee for legal issues. It had created an ad hoc group which is still debating the draft for a comprehensive convention on countering terrorism, countering international terrorism. There are several issues, but to cut it really short, the basic issue is on defining terrorism. There are multiple groups that have contentious understanding of what should be and what should not be terrorism, and on that we'll base the entire convention. For instance, OIC, Organization of Islamic Countries, would not like to include liberation movements, and they do so looking at the Israel-Palestine issue. Then, of course, United States and some of the friends and allies who've been primarily involved in countering terrorism on the ground around the world would not like state forces to be included in terms of actions which could be potentially seen as terrorism. And you have Latin American countries who wish the reverse. They want state terrorism to be, armed forces to be part of the coverage of what would be defined as terrorism. So the very first step of defining what would be terrorism for them itself remains in contention, and as I said, there are multiple pulls and pressures on all sides. But I also want to underline that given the fact that India was the one which brought it in 1996 and it was approved as a UN General Assembly resolution 51 by 210, 17 December 1996. Lately, since the Prime Minister Modi came to power, from the very first address to United Nations 69th session and then onwards in all the forums, for example, he's going end of this month to G20, he's spoken about it there and he'll speak there again hopefully. There is a certain awareness and consensus being built. So multinational groups like Non-Line Movement or BASIC or IBSA or BRICS are really on board in pushing that as an idea. But definition remains at this stage the problem. I think the most recent was the Vice President Venkaiah Naidu was in Paris addressing Paris Peace Forum, where he mentioned that there is an urgent need, and of course the only MP from Sikkim addressed last week this 6th committee and said that perhaps need to narrow down geopolitical differences, right, so that we can arrive at some definition and move on from there. So that's how it looks right now.
Right. Ambassador, terrorism is terrorism at the end of the day. I mean, how difficult is it to define terrorism? Why hasn't the world been able to come to a consensus, really?
It will never be easy. One of the first attempts at defining terrorism was way back in 1937, when there was a terror attack in which one of the leaders in Europe had been killed. And the League of Nations adopted a treaty on a convention on terrorism. It actually defined terrorism. But that convention was never ratified by countries, so it never came into effect. And thereafter, they even tried to adopt a convention on adopting an international criminal court. But that again did not come into effect. Now we have an international criminal court, but that excludes terrorism. So defining terrorism, and India wants a universal definition of terrorism, is not easy. The current draft that is there with the UN, the legal committee, as Professor Swaran Singh mentioned, has a definition of terrorism. And perhaps there might be agreement on that also, but the real issue is the two carve-outs that he mentioned. How do you exclude state security forces? Because the Western countries insist, and I suppose India too would, that state security forces would come under a different set of laws, international humanitarian laws. And then there is the other exception, that is the so-called freedom fighters. What do you do with them? Do they also get the same exemption that security forces will get, or are they to be classified as terrorists? Now, the approach that some countries take is that the issue of foreign occupation and freedom fighters, that should be handled separately. But the methodology of that terrorists use, which is killing people at random, that has been fairly well defined in the current draft, and that should be allowed to be enforced, with exception for the state security forces, because as I said, they come under the Geneva Conventions and there's enough accountability for them.
Right. You know, General, taking the point that the ambassador made forward, of course, so what distinguishes a terrorist organization from a liberation movement, really?
That's exactly the problem. Terrorism or a terrorist act per se is a terrorist act, and nobody should have any problem about identifying that act or identifying a terrorist. But more often than not, these terrorists are fighting for a cause, a separatist cause, which in the eyes of the other country where they are taking shelter is a freedom movement. Take the example of Khalistan. The UK and Canada are so liberal about it, they say we have freedom of speech. They have not committed a crime here. They have not committed a terrorist act here. So we cannot prevent them from calling for a referendum, for calling for a separate state of Khalistan, or for espousing an act in India which is harmful to you, but it's not a crime in their own country. So I think it should be possible to agree on the definitions of a terrorist who's not fighting for another ideology or a state. And to that effect, the United Nations, which is the main body which will recognize these definitions, it has progressed in the sense it has been at the request of member countries designating individuals, organizations as others as international terrorists. But when it comes to those people who are fighting for a separate country, a secessionist movement, I think we have to use leverage bilaterally with that country. And there, I think India is gaining economic importance, diplomatic importance. So we are making headway in every bilateral visit. This issue is included in the discussions and some progress is being made. So it's a question of terrorists versus terrorists fighting for a cause like a separate country.
Absolutely. But at the end of the day, Professor, we need to work towards a universal convention too, isn't it? Because terrorism is a major problem, and like I mentioned in my intro as well, it's affecting all the nations from Asia to the Americas. Everyone is affected as a result of terrorism. So why can't a universal convention come forth?
I think that's a very interesting way to put it. For almost till early 70s, all the influential powers and narratives explain terrorism as outcome of poverty, disease, deprivation, and they looked at it as a problem of poor countries, largely internal law and order issue. So therefore, no serious effort was made actually to address issue of terrorism at the level of international law. So creating a convention of the kind India is proposing now. It's only from 1970, the Munich Olympics, if you remember, the Israeli players were attacked. And that created a certain sense of transnational terrorism. But 9/11 ultimately, and of course 26/11 in our country, generated that sense of this being a shared problem of all the countries. And also clear disjunction that it's not poverty that necessarily is consequential, that outcome of poverty, that terrorism is rising in certain countries. Now you have some of the prosperous parts of India, for example, Punjab in 1980s after Green Revolution. And if you look at per capita incomes in Northeast or Kashmir, they are not the poorest part of the country. So that issue has been buried now clearly. And now the sense that maybe effort at the international law level and conventions need to be made, but even now it's only a gamut of laws which are seen as functioning in that direction, whether they are the international law on financial transactions, on refugees, on use of force, which is meant for dealing with what armed forces do and how to evaluate that. So at this stage there are a gamut of international law, but no generic international law on terrorism or convention on terrorism. Even these whole negotiations of last 20 years in the ad hoc committee in United Nations General Assembly has produced about 3 important protocols.
Yeah.
So International Protocol on Suppression of Terrorist Bombing is one, International Convention on Suppression of Nuclear Attacks is another, then third one is the Protocol on International Convention on Financing Terrorism. And of course you have the Financial Action Task Force already in place, which is already tightening the noose on Pakistan, as we know. So there are a whole pilferage of agencies, actions, laws, which now have become much more active and aware of the problem. But I want to make the quick last point. As General said, it's perhaps relatively easy today to identify terrorist acts, terrorist organizations. What is terrorism? I think on that there is still a problem. And most people around the world still go by 1998 book called Political Terrorism by Schmid and Jungmann, which believes that terrorism is, according to them, and that's generally accepted, is anxiety inspiring method of continuous violent actions, which aim at 2 kinds of targets. One, targets of opportunity, which are easy to hit, and symbolic and representative targets. Now, these are seen as messengers to indirectly manipulate the real target. But that's a very academic definition at this stage. So I think that is still a challenge, that how to define terrorism. And until we define that as a standard definition, one country's terrorists will continue to be freedom fighters for the other, depending on the political differences. So that's I think that's a kind of a serious knot that need to be cracked.
Absolutely. You know, Ambassador, the fact that the professor brought up Pakistan, and also the professor brought up the fact that, you know, it's easy to identify terrorist organizations as such, even after identifying acts of terror, even after identifying, terrorist organizations, the world is not one on labeling them as terrorist organizations. There are differences of opinion as far as various countries are concerned as well. You know, Lashkar-e-taiba is a prime example of that.
Yes, for India, there's a very special problem, which is far more acute and far more serious than what other countries face, because we have a neighboring country, Pakistan, which uses terrorism as an instrument of state policy, and which insists that practically any kind of violence in India is a freedom movement, not only in Kashmir, but elsewhere also. Pakistan has all kinds of definitions of what that violence in India means. And Pakistan not only gives shelter to terror groups, but actually sponsors them as well. So it defends and protects them. So India's problem is even more serious, because any terror group that is based in Pakistan, certainly the ones, whether it's Afghanistan or it is India, they are all dubbed as freedom fighters, and therefore they are justified by Pakistan. So our problem is far more acute, and so we have to keep hammering at this point that terror camps and terror organizations must be banned, and any kind of cross-border terrorism must be an extraditable offense, as India is demanding, and that there should be a complete ban on financing of terrorism. And here, fortunately, the Western world also now realizes, especially after 9/11, that there is a problem of terrorism in the world. And these countries are also at least agree with India on these issues, that terrorism should not be a method. Even if there are freedom movements elsewhere or separatist movements, they have to be conducted through constitutional processes, or at least through peaceful means, and not through violent means.
You know, at the end of the day, General, is the world at least one on what constitutes an act of terror, or is there ambiguity there as well?
Well, I think an act of terror, all nations should agree on it. I don't know who are opposed to it, but it's a question of geopolitics. The man who has carried out an act of terror or sponsored an act of terror should also be easy to identify. But countries drag their feet. I'll give you the example of China, which is dragging its feet in declaring or supporting the declaration of Masood Azhar as a terrorist in the United Nations. Why? Because their relations with Pakistan are affected. Pakistan is supporting Masood Azhar. And likewise, I would say mainly because more than 80% of the major terrorist groups around the world have to do with Islamic terror, and Islamic terror means largely supported by Islamic nations as well. Saudi Arabia is a case in point. The geopolitics comes in the way. Many terrorist groups have not yet been proscribed. I would say in the case of Pakistan, where their involvement is proved time and again in most acts of terrorism in the Western world, Pakistan has not yet been declared a state sponsor of terror. We ourselves have not yet declared it a state sponsor of terror, although we are the worst affected. In the Global Terrorism Index, we are number 6 most affected nation in the world affected by terrorism. So I think it is geopolitics. As long as geopolitics is at play, which always will be, you will find some countries do not recognize some acts as acts of terror or shy away from acknowledging that it was done by so-and-so or terrorist groups.
Right. Yes, Professor, you wanted to add something.
I think you mentioned, Frank, about terrorist acts. In military parlance, we talk about teeth to tail ratio. People who act are basically frontal agents, but there is also a chain of people behind them. So how do you identify that act? Invariably, a suicide bomber kills himself along the event. But then there's a whole chain of people who are supporting that, who are financing that. I will go to the extent of who are providing weapons. I mean, look at these terrorists. They have no dearth of equipment, whether it is satellite phones or Pajero cars or automatic weapons. Now, how do they get access to these? So I think when you say act of terrorism and attempt to identify act, that itself is also equally complex, because there's a whole chain of people behind. And those people sometimes are not really visible. Sometimes when they are visible, they have protection of the state. So I think 2611 here is a great example of masterminds are identified, known, but have state protection. And how a whole city can be held hostage, I mean, just by 10 people. If they were working simply driven by their, lone wolf kind of situation, they wouldn't be as effective, because they are supported by a whole range of agencies, groups, individuals. So act itself is much deeper and wider than what you see on the surface. So I think that is equally important to understand. So very often, if the focus is limited to see the act, maybe we are missing the wood for trees in that sense.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it's a very valid point that you raised. We'll have to look at the issue holistically. We have to look at terror financing and all the other facets associated with terror itself. But that having been said, closing comments now from all my guests, starting first with you, Ambassador. 20 odd years that we've been trying to, deliberate on this particular issue, try and come to some kind of a consensus as far as terrorism is concerned, and we are still not close to the end. Can we see the end anytime soon?
Not anytime soon, but I think we should certainly keep pressing. I think it's important that you keep telling the world that terrorism has to be condemned. And while we should certainly try and show understanding for causes that lead to liberation struggles, for example, or human rights issues, that should not lead to any kind of condoning of violence. We have to insist that whatever cause an individual has, whatever grievance he has to pursue it through non-violent means. Violence should not be condoned on any ground whatsoever, because once we do that, then the road to terrorism is open.
Absolutely. General, going forward now, what do you think that we need to do to try and address this particular problem, and what should be the protocol really when it comes to terrorism?
On your last point, the history of the world is wars and conflicts. As long as wars and conflicts continue, this kind of support by one country or the other to terrorist groups for their own ends and means will continue. As far as what we should do, I think we should use the leverage that we have, the economic leverage that we have bilaterally with other countries, to get them to our point of view and support the definition that we support in the United Nations for getting this convention passed, and also in multilateral forums like the ambassador said, BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization and such like groupings, where we have some clout. We should pursue with our partners, support for our view on terrorism.
Right. Professor, India has time and again raised this particular issue at international forums. You mentioned in your opening remarks as well that Prime Minister Modi from day one has been trying to get some kind of a consensus as far as terrorism or an international convention on terrorism is concerned. But are the other countries really as enthused as India?
I think increasingly larger number of nations are getting at least concerned, if not enthused about it. That is partly because terrorism also is becoming a completely global threat increasingly, and you never know where it is going to strike and how it is going to strike. But that's also what leads to my very quick second point. Creating any international convention, even on the most simple things like creating International Yoga Day, is an enormous task. And when you have as fluid territory, uncertain area as terrorism, when we don't even know what it is and how to define it, it's going to take time. So I think we should not be thinking that it can be clinched very quickly. But yes, the momentum is there, but challenges are really deep and really difficult to address here. And the devil lies in the fact that terrorism is always invisible. You don't know. These are a fluid reality of who is a terrorist. In a room, you could have a terrorist without knowing, and there is one. So they don't have addresses, they don't have institutions, there is no traditional way of deterring them, threatening them, punishing them. So even this effort of CCIT to criminalize terrorism, even when we achieve this, we will still have limitations. But that's an important first step, and I think there is a certain momentum one can notice in that direction happening. So we are assuming that greater consensus is going to be built in some point in time, but it's going to take enormous efforts.
Okay, I've got some more time left on the program, so a couple of quick questions as well. Ambassador, considering the fact that terrorist organizations like the Islamic State and others in in West Asia, we've seen their role and their size diminish over the years as a result of what the Americans and others have done in that particular region. Is the world still going to see terror the same way it used to a few years ago?
I think terror will continue because while there has been a diminishing of the powers of, let's say, Islamic State because of the actions of the Assad government in Syria and because of the actions of the US forces in Iraq. But then there are other areas where I think they're becoming important. One of the reasons why, for example, the Russians are softening towards the Taliban is they fear that the Islamic State might gain strength in Afghanistan.
No, but a quick counter question there. But are these countries going to be as serious as they were a few years ago? Because terrorism is far more localized now, maybe in pockets in Afghanistan and elsewhere.
I won't say it's localized. The actors are changing. The Taliban, for example, are becoming perhaps slightly more moderate. I'm not sure if they are really. But the very fact that the Russia, for example, is willing to talk to them, and other countries like even India managed to send an unofficial delegation there, means that they are trying to bring the Taliban into the mainstream. But that means that the Islamic State will then take the space that's vacated by the Taliban. So perhaps the forces are changing. But at the same time, you have, for example, Qatar is being accused by Saudi Arabia of sponsoring terrorism. Now these are factors that did not take place earlier. So the forces keep changing, but the conflicts among countries and where states start using terrorism as an instrument, especially in other countries, then it becomes a major problem for other countries and for the common people as well.
Right. Yeah. Yes, General.
Our major concern should be Pakistan. Because terrorist groups are being used as part of asymmetric warfare. One country is stronger, the other is weaker. So this gives much better dividends when you use terrorist groups. But when terrorist groups get out of your control and start taking over the country, like it appears to be happening in Afghanistan, if the Taliban come to power, and similarly if in Pakistan terrorist groups have their sway and things like nuclear weapons fall in their hands, that is a dreaded situation. What will happen then? Other terrorist groups around the world are going to get inspired to seize power in that way.
Right.
So that will become it will become unmanageable for us. It will become risky for us, not only for us, for the rest of the world as well.
That having been said, the fact that technology has advanced tremendously over the years, intelligence gathering too has become better over the years. Has that been able to put a lid on terrorism, and has that affected or impacted terrorism the way you would have liked to see it happen?
Definitely, definitely. And that is why intelligence sharing is becoming ever more widespread amongst friendly countries. Many of the warnings received by us about major terrorist attacks, including the 26/11 attack, came from the Americans and the Israelis. So intelligence sharing is a very important aspect against this global war on terrorism. I think on that there is no difference of opinion, except that intelligence is being shared on a selective basis where perhaps the country having the intelligence does not consider itself at risk because of sharing that intelligence.
Right.
They have much more information.
But as a result of it, we've been able to preempt and, maybe stop some of these attacks at some level. Yes, close the show for us with your concluding remarks,
We
Professor.
also need to underline the positive element in what has been the effort so far, and as General said, increasingly trend of intelligence sharing. So I want to underline there are always several episodes that never happened. And we never come to know of those episodes. So sometimes we think, it's invariably the terrorists who are winning, but that's not true. There are several episodes that we never come to know, and they are neutralized or derailed or sabotaged by agencies that are responsible to do that task. But as regards technology, that also generates a very new genre of violence, which is not traditional violence where you see blood and death and destruction.
Yeah.
Cyber security, collapsing a system in a country, either financial system or aviation system or banking system, potentially that could also be what terrorists do. And I want to make a last point. What is so difficult about terrorism is they are known for never using extraordinary weapons, but using weapons extraordinarily. So, for example, civilian aeroplane hitting a kind of a tower of trade tower and destroying it completely with a certain precision. How did that happen? So, this is a certain difficult proposition whether we can actually predict all possible threats that terrorism poses to us. Therefore, we go back and say international conventions would only strengthen the domestic law and order of sovereign nations, because they can keep a complete tab on each of their citizens.
Right.
And that's what also is important, that you really need to have access to all your citizens, and they should have access to the state structures, so that there's a certain coordination at national level as well, not only international level, but national level as well, so that you can detect the wrong people before they become really dangerous.
Integration and coordination is what you're talking about. All right, on that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.